Look, in a way, I've always been a writer, and it began for me in my childhood growing up in Carlton. One of my novels, Scraps of Heaven, is a portrait actually of that extraordinary time. It's set in 1958 when we were a working class multicultural inner Melbourne suburb. And in a way, the template for my later work goes back to that time. And so I lived in two worlds. On the streets of Carlton, I was a kind of Aussie kid hanging out with my mates. Street life was very rich back then, with all its harmonies and its conflicts. And there were people from Jewish background, Italian, Greek, Yugoslav, and Australian working class living side by side. And I loved the streets. I absolutely loved being out on the streets. But then there was another world I entered as soon as I went into the small single-fronted cottage, 387 Canning Street, where my mother and my father, they carried some kind of burden. Well, there was a magic and a darker side to what was going on in that house. You know, I would lie in bed at night and I'd hear from the distant kitchen my parents with their old world friends, naming places: Bialystok, Bielsk, Grudik, Orly, Bryansk. And it was a kind of a dreaming on the other side of the earth. And my mum used to perform Yiddish song before the war, and in Bialystok. And my father had been a Yiddish poet, and here he was working in factories and on Victoria Market. He was kind of not realising his own potential. And my mum, she was singing all the time Yiddish songs around the house. And every now and then she'd go into a kind of psychic rage. And she'd been an idealist, a member of a socialist movement, and I think she felt betrayed by life. And there was an absence in that house. There were photographs of people. Who are they? One of my three brothers, my three sisters, your cousins Heimke and Frida. Where are they? I don't want to talk about it. She maintained a silence about what had happened, but it came through in her body. I mean, as a writer, I've learned so much about how much the body says, the gestures that betray what you really are feeling. And when she sang, there was a kind of edge to it. She had a vast repertoire of Yiddish song. But those psychic rages were hard to take. And in the novel, Scraps of Heaven, the main character, Josh, and I chose to fictionalise it for various reasons, he's always running out into the streets, but he's always coming back. He's coming back to be, because there's something compelling about this woman with the dark black eyes who, would be almost like a gypsy. And she would be going to these other worlds, strange worlds. And two things happened that were vital to my future life as a storyteller and writer. And the first thing was that the intensity of those psychic rages was such that sometimes it became intolerable. And I remember once going to the bedroom, locking the door, not locking it, just closing the door, and I sat down and I began to write. Now, I don't remember what I wrote, but what I remember very clearly is that I was about, 11, 12 years old. The pen took off across the page. And when I stood up, an amazing thing happened. Like when I walked into that room, I felt heavy. But when I left, I felt light, detached. Nothing could get to me. So I had discovered expression. Ex means out. When you go to the island of Ithaca, you don't say cheers, you say exo tavasana. Ithaca is the island where my wife's family comes from. Exo tavasana, outside with my problems, out. And then I began to discover something else, that whatever project you embark upon as a writer, you begin by getting it out, and in getting it out, you begin to work it out. Right? So that happened very early. But the other thing that happened and it's critical to the topic that was suggested for this session, is that the only way I could be with my mum was to accept her for who she was, not question the worlds she used to sink into. So I just, at a certain point, I thought, oh, okay, I'll just go with you. So I just go spiraling down with her, right, into her world without question. And I think that's the secret to, years later, being able to sit with, people who'd been through whatever in their lives, and to be just there, present to them.
To build on your writing skills, though, from that moment of expression to an intellectual world, given there are a few academics in the room, can you share your academic credentials as well, in terms, not that they're needed in any sense, but I think it's interesting for us about the different ways that writing can occur, because you had started an academic life and before 1991.
Yeah, well, what happened is I went to Melbourne University. I used to dream of going there. I remember the tram would go past and I'd say, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful? And back then, you could get a scholarship, come through the state school system and on merit get a scholarship that enabled you to afford it as well. And I was there at a time of extraordinary intellectual ferment. Robert Mann, Ray Gator, we're still close friends, Peter Singer. It was this time when university was as it should be, a place of excitement, exploration, a time to dare, to go into all kinds of places. And I was studying history and political science, and I actually did teach and lecture in political science. I studied anthropology, went to Columbia University, but something else was always happening. Something else was always happening, and that was that I never entirely felt comfortable with the language of the social sciences. I learned a lot from it, I got a lot from it. I was lucky to study with Margaret Mead at Columbia University, and it was a great adventure, but I was always trying to break the boundaries and go back to another way of seeing and another way of being. So it was almost like a private life was happening in my journals. I was keeping journals wherever I travelled. And I also became a grassroots traveller. And even at Columbia University, I was also involved in street projects where I was connecting with the kids on the streets. And I had two mediums, the journal I was keeping and photography also, to capture what I was experiencing. And there came a point, to cut a long process short, where I just left Melbourne University. I was a lecturer and I said, no, there is something else waiting for me. And I left, and eventually it led to all of this, I guess, yeah.
Yeah. We'll come back to that travel as a source for so many of the rich stories, but I just wanted to sort of cover the range of your style of output, because we've got the memoir, the first piece, The Jewels and Ashes. Then we've got 3 novels, Cafe Scheherazade, Scraps of Heaven and Sea of Many Returns. Then we've got your collection of stories, so The Fig Tree, Violin Lessons, and I'd call The Watermelon, would you call that a collection of stories, or how do you represent it? We can come back to that. Then we've got The Fighter, which is the work of non-fiction, and would Wanderers and Dreams also be titled, that's the Tales of the David Herman Theatre? Is that a sort of non-fiction representation? Mm-hmm. So how have you determined along the way whether you choose memoir, fiction or narrative non-fiction?
Just about every book I write, I walk a tightrope between fiction and non-fiction. And then it's decided at a certain point. The word fiction actually comes from the Latin fictio, which means to make or to shape. In other words, fiction originally meant just the way you shape the story. You can have 3 siblings. There's 3 siblings in my family. I've got 2 brothers, and each of us, I'm sure, would have shaped the story of our childhood differently. That's the way it is. And it is a tightrope. I sometimes have these long conversations with my publisher. For example, The Watermill, the very first story, which gave me great pleasure writing. It's set in China. I spent a year in China in 1984, 85. I use all kinds of devices. Now, if there's something that unites both my fiction and non-fiction, it is the art of scene construction, right? Rather than saying this happened and that happened, you create scene after scene after scene. You're writing a novel set in Carlton, the very first scene, a boy's lying in bed and he's hearing the milkman coming late at night, right? And you enter into a scene. All my books enter into a scene, and I move from scene to scene. And once again, what do words mean? Imagination, what does that actually mean? The first 2 syllables are image. So imagination is not necessarily making something up, it's seeing it, hearing it, smelling it, tasting it. In other words, the art of story, as opposed to the political science and the history and the anthropology and the other disciplines, the art of story is a very sensual art. I think that's one of the reasons I wanted to break free, because as a traveller, I was sensing and being in the world and seeing that there are different ways of being, but I felt constricted when I was applying those other frameworks to it.
So the sensing and the being are very powerful themes that I want to take a little bit further. And I want to do it, Arnold, by comparing the covers of the first book, and this is the 25th anniversary edition of Jewels and Ashes. And I don't know if you can see it here, but the cover is very evocative of a man on a wagon. And when I looked at the back, it said cover design by scribe, cover photograph by Arnold Zable. So this is Arnold's photo. And then I turned to The Watermill, and I'll show it to the camera as well as to you all, and it's here. And it's this beautiful image. And again, as I turn to the back, cover photo, courtesy of the author. So these are both photos that Arnold took on travels, and they have such a similarity to me in their evocation of the place. So I wondered, Arnold, as I pick up my notes, whether you can share with us about something about the photography in your life, but also about these 2 photos and their placing on the covers.
It's a wonderful thing that Kim picked up on. And once I take this opportunity to thank Kim. Kim's been absolutely amazing. It's a friendship and a kind of kinship. I feel a deep kinship with Kim. But when you suggested it to me the other day, I hadn't thought about that. That these 2 books, they book in 30 years of writing in a way, and both the covers are photographs I took. But you look at those photos, and they're the photos that can only be taken by a grassroots traveller. Like one of them is the road in Jewels and Ashes that actually leads to the village where 2 of my grandfathers were born, and where my great-grandfather, David Zabludovsky, my father changed it to Zable, used to be the postman. And to walk that road day after day was an extraordinary experience. I've got to say this, that the turning point for me as a writer, interestingly enough, I came back after a year in China and I thought this will be my first book. Then a number of things happened and I realised that I'd been to so many places, been all over Europe, travelled and worked there, and yet I'd never been to Poland. I'd never been to Russia. I'd never been to ancestral territory. And so I went on a long journey, and I went alone. I just got married, and I said to my partner, I've just got, and she understood. I had to go. It was a pilgrimage, and I went for months. And I went searching for the missing link in the ancestral chain, that absence, those ghosts that I experienced as a child. And I travelled Trans-Siberian because that was part of their ancestral territory. And so, you know, eventually I come to places like this. Remember, Bielsk, Bryansk, Orly, Grudek, Bialystok. This is the road to Orly. And this photograph captures, I guess, what it was to be walking that road, because I did it day after day. And then 30 years later, you have the watermill. The title story, the watermill, which is set in China, revolves around this watermill, where I worked at an agricultural college as a teacher of English with agricultural scientists, as well as with the language department, the language teachers, Russian and English. China was just coming out of the Cultural Revolution. It was an extraordinary kind of interregnum between the madness of the Cultural Revolution and Tiananmen Square. So there was about a 15-year period when China exploded and wanted to connect with the outside world. And I worked in a very remote province called Guizhou. And every night after work, I'd just walk out straight into the countryside. And you know, go to the villages, became known in the villages. One of the first words I learned in Chinese, in Mandarin, was gambei, drink up. They used to give you this heavy spirit called Maltai. And then I'd always end up here in this watermill, which stood on a bridge across the Huaxi River. Flower stream, it means, Huaxi. And you'd hear the mill going thum, 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 round and round, an endless churning. And the miller had a long stem pipe. He was a buoy man. The buoy loved water. And the peasants would come down with their grain, and then he'd make me a cup of tea on this sort of stove he had. I mean, you see, you have to make the effort to come through the mountains. It's a very mountainous province, but when you get through the mountains, you find the watermill and it's magic. And once again, there were moments I was sitting there when I thought to myself, I'm glad. There's a Yiddish expression, right? It says, and it's not necessarily a compliment. You say, so-and-so is a Rob van Weg, which means someone has gone off the path, right? And I was always going off the path. I was always enticed to go, oh, those street kids over there, or that remote province as Guizhou was. It's in the southwest between Sichuan and Yunnan. So yeah, these two photographs I think are emblematic of the way I've gone about things.
And there's the sort of bookends that which we'll come back to in terms of, as you said, your own beginnings, that ancestral anchoring and where you've journeyed. But we'll come back to that in a moment. I wanted to just also look at the way in which you write about other people. So there's a mix of what you do. Some people are given letters in the stories, or some are the real names of the individuals. Some are descriptors, the certain man. Can you share with us the distinctions of how that plays out in the ethical frame for that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think there are stories you tell. There is a major line in one of the stories of the watermill, and I think it came from Elie Wiesel. There are stories meant to be told, and not to tell them is to betray them. So these are stories that come your way, you know, and you want to do justice to them. But at the same time, the writer's question, the main question is, okay, there's a story you want to tell. What's the best way to tell it? You know, and sometimes you walk this, like I said, this tightrope, but not only that's not the only question. The other question is there are ethical considerations. I'm telling other people's stories, and this is a topic we could spend a whole day seminar on. But very briefly, I find myself sometimes, changing people's names or using monikers. Beirut Buchani, for example, does this in No Friend But the Mountains. So I've got characters like the Beijing Man, the Little Gentleman, the old boatman of 100 Flower Lake, and Waipo, which means grandmother. And I do it partly in order to kind of enable myself to play with identities, and then I fess up in the acknowledgements as to what I'm doing. And also, it's one of the ways in which I tackle the ethical dilemmas that present themselves, but there's something else too. When I was writing the title story of The Watermill, it was such a pleasure to do it the way that I stumbled upon doing it. It's just one take. I could have written it so many different ways, but this particular take, it's almost like a series of little myths and legends. The stone carver is built around a man I met who was a stone carver who suffered horribly during the Cultural Revolution. But there was something magic to what he did. And here I really want to say something that occurred to me once again with you going back to Jewels and Ashes and then going to the last work. Jewels and Ashes, that title, it sums up something else that is threaded through all my writings. And that is that no matter what situation you're entering into, right, and there are harrowing situations, the Ballad of Kia Narom, goes into the killing fields set in Cambodia. The story of so many of these areas that you are led down, and you've got to be faithful to the story that includes the darkness, and you've got to explore that darkness. But on the other hand, there's always the jewels. There's always the saving graces. I often say, and often the saving graces and the jewels are very simple. I've often said that the difference between ordinary and extraordinary is just the way you see it. It can be in very, very simple things that Primo Levi called them eloquent episodes, right? And so I'm always acutely aware of this as well. So yes, I'm always segueing between the two, and it's extremely important, this issue of the saving graces, because that's where resistance lies. Beirut Buchani and I became very close, and he used to say to me, there are two things I hate about the way we are represented as refugees and asylum seekers. One is the way the right tends to represent us and misrepresent us and cast us as a mob of dangerous people. That was deliberate. That was Tampa, a mob of people on a boat. You weren't allowed to get near them and see the human face. But he says there's also a tendency on the left to see us as victims. I said, no, we're not victims. We have agency. And they, so many people I've found on my journeys, they found the most extraordinary ways of, despite it all, finding their agency. So that's always has to be part of the story.
It's interesting you link it back to Australia's immigration frame, because one of the things that struck me on reading when you first referred to some of the people by letters, like N and so forth, that in migration law in Australia, all of the cases that have a refugee element are letters, like the very famous recent High Court decision finding unlawful the indefinite detention is NZYQ, they're letters. And part of that is positive to protect the identities of refugee applicants, because if they are returned to their countries and they're identifiable, they're more vulnerable. But at the very same time, and I think Justice Mary Gordon, the first time she had a case that was letters, made this point, it also serves the purpose of dehumanising these individuals. So it really is that fine line, isn't it, when you use letters or I guess part of it is intention and motivation, but it is a reminder of the power of removing the person's identity can be very dehumanizing.
Yeah, and it's an amazing point that you picked up, that parallel. Yeah. Of course, asylum seekers were called by, the very first story I wrote about asylum seekers was in December 2000, and it was called I Am Detainees CAI 20, a guy that was in Woomera Detention Centre. And when I met him, he was an extraordinary man, and he'd taken, in Woomera, talk about an eloquent episode. He had this rock, he was living in the high-rise flats in Fitzroy. He'd carved out of because he was a stonemason at one stage, and in Woomera he'd carved out of the red rock the names of all his loved ones, some of whom had been murdered by the Taliban. And also, and it looked like a rocket. For him it symbolised a flight to freedom. I mean, it all comes down to listening. And then in the end, whether you use a moniker or a letter, the real test is the love and the compassion with which you write it. You write the story. And it does come down to the listening. I mean, there's a story in The Watermill, the fourth one of a quartet, which is called Where We Meet. And this is how I begin, right? Be not enough listening, not enough sitting on the earth, sitting on the veranda, sitting in the shade beneath the house, the land as far as the eye can see, clad in ochres and reds, the sky so blue it hurts, the air so dry it sucks in the breath, yet it is cool enough in the shade to converse, and there's time enough to take in the silence, to notice the far distant cloud. It's going to rain, the old man says. Give it 6 hours, but believe me, it's going to rain. Best place to be is here, sitting in the shade beneath the house. Now, I don't say where that place is for various reasons. I can say now it's out in the Kimberley somewhere, a project I've been involved in, and that's a famous Kimberley artist. It did rain, by the way, about 6 hours later, but that's the heart of it, just sitting in the dirt. When I think about Carlton, I think a lot about the gutter. The gutter in Scraps of Heaven is a river. In the winter, when the rains fell, it was like a river, and we used to launch matchsticks and have boat races down it. That's an eloquent episode. That's picking up on the little things that turn the ordinary into the extraordinary. And I want to say that part of listening, and this is something that First Nations people know so well, part of listening is not only listening to the words, but listening to the silences, and not only listening to the silences, but listening to the physicality of a place. When Sea of Many Returns is a novel set partly on the island of Ithaca, and it's based on 4 generations of an Ithacan family. And Dora and I, when our son was growing up, would go there and spend months on end in the village. And I did not understand. So here's a beautiful island. Ithaca is beautiful. The island of Odysseus, right? And it's steeped in mythology and beauty. And yet, Ithacans left in droves. And they left partly because the land, it was rocky. Homer's rocky Ithaca. The land couldn't sustain them. But I didn't really understand it until I went through a full season, about 2 or 3 months of the olive picking, going up into the family groves in the mountains and having to walk that rocky earth. And the last job you did is that you'd gather all of last year's cut-offs, prunings, because they were very hard and sharp. And you'd build bonfires and burn them, and the winds would be blowing them here and there. And at one stage, I was running around, with a bucket trying to control the flow of the fire. And it occurred to me that I've become a shepherd of the winds. Now think about that. Poetry comes out of that kind of being in a landscape, being in a place, being in a location, and feeling it. And then I could also understand why, despite all the beauty, people still made those long journeys to find a better life elsewhere.
So those journeys have been very key for you, and there are quite a few. Let's come back to the watermill actually a bit more specifically. And as you've explained, the first one is in China and it's post-cultural revolution. Can you tell us the sort of the context for each of them? So that's the watermill, and then the Ballad of Keona Na'arom. Yeah. Can you share with people that context?
So I was involved through International PEN. I've been very active in PEN for 30 years now. And I got involved with a project that we set up where I went to Cambodia 3 years running, 2013, 14, 15, worked in Phnom Penh, Battambang and Siem Reap with writers, Cambodian writers, ran workshops with Cambodian writers. And Keona Na'arom, I had a 3-day workshop in Phnom Penh, the first one, and I gave a long lecture with an interpreter because not everyone understood English. And it was about, because we had 3 days, I thought I'll spend the first morning talking about my own journey as a writer. And I think it's because of that lecture that I met Keona Na'arom. She was 70 years old, and she came up to me in the afternoon break and said, I've got a story to tell you. And then she began telling me that story, an extraordinary story. She had become Cambodia's leading ethnomusicologist. And she had also become, had a PhD on science and literature, involved in children's literature. I mean, she left Phnom Penh and with her family, when the day Phnom Penh was emptied out, with her family, 4 children and a whole, in the end it was just 2 sisters left. Now let me just read you one passage. This says so much about, I think I've got it here. Yes, this says so much. I'll just read it. So we're outside the king's palace, right? Because King Sihanouk was going to be cremated, and there were 1 million people from the provinces in Phnom Penh. So we're stuck in a gridlock, and Keona Na'arom's in the front seat, and the president of PEN Cambodia is translating, and I'm sitting in the back seat. And this is what I write. I sit in the back seat and listen to Na'arom and intently. The windows are closed and the interior is cooled by air conditioning. Each of us has a role: teller, interpreter, and listener. Story is the currency that unites us, conferring on us a detached intimacy. The milling crowds appear like a supporting cast in a pantomime. There are moments that cut deep in the memory, and this is one of them. All the elements are assembled: the story and the enclosed space in which it is being told, the city so close yet cut off from hearing. The stillness accentuates the melodious flow of Na'arom's voice, its shifts in energy and occasional falter. I register each change in tone and expression, the slight shaking of her head in disbelief that such things had happened. I feel the gravity of what she is recalling, acutely aware of my own voice as it breaks the silences with questions. I am suspicious of that voice and fearful of reopening old wounds, fearful of what the telling is doing to the teller, but also possessed by a sense of obligation to hear Na'arom out. I cannot help but pursue the story. I think that goes to the heart of the matter in a way.
And one of the themes of her story is her commitment to always looking forward. That's a theme that comes out, and I love the way you then link her to your own mother and contrast the consequences of such traumatic lives. Yet your mum and father were part of the movement Kadima, and Kadima means forward.
That's a very interesting point that you bring up. And, you know, most people you meet, if you listen to them carefully, they've got, Charles Dickens was a master of this, by the way, a kind of signature refrain. You know, I'm humble, Uriah Heep, you know. I mean, things are looking up, I think, Macabre, whatever. The signature refrain, and hers was forward, en avance. You know, she spoke French, and it said so much about her inner spirit, you know. But look, this brings up another question. You're sitting at the writing desk, and the space in telling these stories I like to be in most is the witness state. It's not about me. I'm witnessing this, right? But then there comes a moment, especially if you're doing narrative non-fiction, but there comes a moment when you say, hang on, there's a connection here that's deeply personal. Do I or don't I segue from the witness state to the subject? And sometimes you decide one way or the other. And two dramatic examples. One is in the Ballad of Keona Rom, where she kept reminding me of my mum. She just kept, she even looked like her. And they both loved music. And in the end I decided to keep it out, but write a coda about that. And in the coda, well, just read it for yourself where it goes. But another dramatic example, I call this the mirror. You know, expression was the first movement towards becoming a storyteller. For want of a better word, impression, listening to others, became the second movement. But I've found that if story is the art of the specific, if you're true to the specifics of a story, it will be universal. So here I am in Vietnam in the summer of 1969-70. And I'm with a rucksack on my back and I'm traveling there, right? It was a crazy venture. I had a journalist visa. And this is something I write in violin lessons, a story called The Dust of Life. So when I was in Saigon, it was the height of the war, 500,000 American soldiers, 10,000 Australian soldiers, something like that. It was insane. But the thing that stood out was that there was an American journalist who was so distressed at what was happening. He got money from a foundation. They set up a kind of a space where there were 50 pandanus leaf mattresses, more or less, and there were kids aged between 9 and 14, 15, and they were called the dust of life by the Vietnamese. That was the term for them. And they used to do everything from shine shoes to lead soldiers to brothels, to drug dealers. They knew it all. And but at night they had this kind of family. So one day one of them says, I want to take you out for a meal. Takes me to a place in Cholon, the China section of Saigon, and he takes out a packet of tobacco and he rolls a cigarette and he's sucking away, and I'm looking at a kid, and then I'm looking at a very hardened face, and 30 years later I'm writing the story and I'm seeing it, and he's telling me, you know, in a kind of American Creole it picked up, you know, that 2 years ago my village was bombed, and as I ran from the flames, I stopped dead in my tracks, and I looked back and realised I'd never see my parents alive again. I'm sitting at the writing desk and I'm thinking, do I or don't I? And in the end I felt I had to go back 10,000 kilometres, whatever, in space to that house, 387 Canning Street, and 10 years in time only. And here's my mum waking up from a recurring dream. And in this dream, she always used to yell, Mama. And one day I crept down the passage and I heard her tell my dad that she'd had that dream again, where her village is on fire and she's running from the flames with her brothers and sisters. And one by one, they fall and she's the last one left running. What would you do at the writing desk at that moment? So I decided, okay, I'll switch from witness to subject, because once again you decide because of a kind of sense of obligation and that issue of I can't betray this story. I can't betray this story.
So using the theme of betrayal, that takes us to the third story, which is the Republic of the Stateless. And for those of us lawyers, there's such a wonderful play on that concept, in the sense that, of course, statelessness is without the structure of governance, yet the Republic of statelessness is almost the state of statelessness. And it's such a powerful story of Sonia and Sammy. Do you want to tell us a little bit more and that link to that question of betrayal?
So this is the largest story, this is the longest story in the book, and it's an extraordinary story about the woman who became my son's surrogate grandmother, and very modest woman, Sonia Lizaron. And I sort of, she was extraordinary. She lived to 96. She lived in many places. And I didn't know that she'd been involved with a theatre that was set up in Bergen-Belsen just after the war, just after it ended. An amazing theatre called the Cassette Theatre, the concentration camp theatre. And I loved Sonia. She was a gorgeous woman. My son adored her, absolutely adored her. And she became, among other things, a concert singer as well. She'd been an actress, and she used to give concerts of Yiddish songs. She was living in New York. When I first met her, she came to Melbourne and gave a concert of Yiddish music. Ended up spending her last years in Melbourne. And when she died, I delivered the eulogy, but then someone read it and got in contact with me from Israel, Ari Olevsky, and he had known her first husband, Sammy Feder, who was the director who'd set up that theatre. And he started telling me something. It took the story in a whole new direction. And so here I was exploring this relationship between Sonia and Sammy. I mean, what they created was absolutely extraordinary. They reenacted what had happened to them. They stood on stage and reenacted the horrors as well as their resistance. They had a play about the partisans and resistors as well. Now, they rehearsed for a couple of months, and then in September 1945, just months after liberation, they had the premiere of the Theatre of the Impossible. Sammy called it the Theatre of the Clenched Fist. And they performed in a tent that held 1,000 people, but 3,000 crowded in. And this tent used to be a field tent that the Nazis used to give lectures to, Himmler and people like that used to come and give lectures to the officer corps. And there was a riot outside because people couldn't get in because they wanted to see themselves reflected on stage, right? And, I described, we haven't got time to get into it, I described that, just what happened on that night. People were screaming in the audience. People were weeping and laughing, and there were long silences. And it took theatre back to its essence, back to the ancient tragedies, where you were reflecting the soul of and the very being of people. And but in terms of the limits of time that we've got, the most fascinating thing about Sammy and Sonia is that I began to realise that, going to the topic that was set, this was memory and forgetting, but forgetting as an act of resistance, because at a certain point Sonia wanted to move on, but Sammy spent the rest of his life writing book after book in Yiddish in Herzliya in near Tel Aviv, and he just could not get beyond that time. And Sonia just wanted to move on. And talk about gestures. Gestures say much. Kierna Rom would talk like this. She had the movements of the Asparas, right? Of the celestial dances that you see at Angkor Wat. A whole culture was embodied in her fingers. Sonia Lizaron whenever you came close to the darkness of what had happened, she'd go like this, and I built it into the story. She'd close her eyes and rub her knuckles across the eyes because she didn't want to go there. And then she'd open them, and when she opened them, she was with you. She just wanted to be with you in the present moment. And I've often reflected that they're two legitimate ways. It's not a matter of one or the other. One became obsessed, the other one did it. She even went to India and stayed in an ashram. She worked with Gurdjieff people when she was in Paris. She did everything she could to get beyond it, and she did. She did get beyond it, I think. And so, but as I was writing it, you know, I begin with that line near the beginning somewhere, their stories meant to be told, and not to tell them is to betray them. But the final line is, I think I'll read you the final line of this, because this is what it's like. This is, look, you go to these spaces, you can't betray them. You can't betray these stories. So, because I'm reimagining. Talk about fiction and non-fiction. I reimagine things. I recreate scenes. I recreate the moment they met each other again after the war in Bergen-Belsen, right? They performed together just before the war. And in the end, I write this: yes, there are tales that are meant to be told, and not to tell them would be a betrayal. Sammy and Sonia, I hope I have done your tales justice, that I have not betrayed you. The thought is unbearable. They've got no recourse, they're gone. So it's this fragile thing. Holding a story is fragile.
In the final Where We Meet, you bring together various stories that sort of ground us in country in terms of Indigenous stories, civex, and then back to your own family. Can you tell us the Indigenous civex, and then we'll end, I think, I'm keeping an eye, we've got 5 minutes, so.
Well, look, you know, originally there were 5 stories in the book, and one of them was called Zaras Laabi. Oh, talk about, you can't script it in fiction, Zaras Laabi. And it began for an article in The Age about Faris Shohani, who lost his first wife and daughter to the ocean, Zara, who was 9 years old. And I got to know him well. There were 7 civex survivors who came to Australia, and 3 came to Melbourne. I tell the story of a male, I call it the Ancient Mariner in violin lessons. But with Faris, he remarried this beautiful woman who'd also been a Faili Kurd, like she was, a gorgeous woman. And she told me, with him present, that in his dreams, he sings a lullaby to his daughter, Zara. So originally I wrote it up in The Age, and it was called Zara's Lullaby, but in these instances, I always go to the person and read the whole story aloud. I went to Faris and I said, here's the story. Do you permit me to publish it? And he said to me, yes, on one condition, that her photograph is published with it, which says it all, right? So, but in the end, the publisher thought, I have wonderful editors at Text, big picture editors that can see things. And so in the end, they said, why don't you combine it with the final story? So there it's called Where We Meet, and it begins with that passage I read, being not enough listening, where I try to see where do we meet in this country, right? The story of my own family and what they've suffered and how they found a new life here in Australia. My journeys with Auntie Joy and other Wurundjeri elders in the 1990s. And also the story of a civex survivor, a refugee. And if there is a thing that unites all 3 for me, well, a couple of things. One is a Yiddish concept, Luftmensch, which I bring up in Cafe Scheherazade for the first time. It's adapted from a Yiddish word that actually means wheeler dealer. A Luftmensch is a man of air, right? Sort of a wheeler dealer. But I've adapted it to mean a person that's been running from one place to the next for so long, like the characters in Café Scheherazade, that they no longer feel the ground beneath their feet. They become uprooted. And I found, and so one area I explore this, where Barak, the great uncle, the famous William Barak, great Aboriginal Wurundjeri resistor and storyteller, who was Auntie Joy's great uncle, when you look at portraits of him and photos of him, he's got that look of the Luftmensch. And when you know, my father had that look, my mother had that look, that I'm not completely here. But there's a key line in that story, which I repeat a couple of times, when I refer to my own family, and he came from the old world, or she came from the old world to the new. So our parents used to call Poland the old world. So they came from the old world to the new, only to find out that the new was far more ancient than the old. And I think this is the beauty of who we are, really. I mean, this is really at our best. And boy, do we sometimes act at our worst. But at our best, this is what we are, this incredible combination of living in an ancient space where people have got this deep, deep connection to country and so much to teach us, and yet at the same time, it's been a space that we're finally, you know, Faris Shohani and my parents, in that story, they both talk about how much they finally felt at home here. So look, maybe we'll end with this, because we'll go back to the beginning, right? Because really, Kim, you know, this thing you picked up on, the photos of the first and the last book are kind of a circle. And when I was finishing Jewels and Ashes, there was an epilogue where there are a few scenes with my mum and my dad in their aging, when finally I think they really reconcile with this place. My father got to love especially the Moreton Bay figs that were in the local park. They said, they're my temple. And I never knew he used to go there at night and find refuge there, sit there, when it all got to him, you know, what had happened, the repression of his creativity that he'd experienced. He did become a Yiddish poet again, by the way, and he did after he retired, and he wrote some beautiful poems, some of which were turned into songs. But this is about my mum, and I'll end on this note. So once again, image, imagination, can you see it? This old rundown 387 Canning Street. And I write this: there is a certain position by the kitchen table from which a window high on the wall opposite the bathroom can be seen. Here mother often sits and gazes at the upper branches of a tree. Timber frames divide the window into 12 separate squares so that the light streams in at many angles and degrees of intensity. Sometimes it is restrained, the branches barely visible. At other moments it blazes a luminous gold. In winter, the branches are thin and bare, while in spring they erupt with leaves. In her aging, mother's life has been reduced to a simple equation, a silence with infinite variations on tranquility and light. Concentrated, framed, contained, yet full of subtle movement and change. The silence is barely broken, except for a sudden gust of wind, the distant barking of a dog, the twittering of birds. They return each year, mother announces from one of her reveries. Birds can speak, she adds. They have a language of their own. They probably talk about where they have been for the past year. They perch on that tree and chatter to each other. You can hear how pleased they are to be back.
Well, how pleased are we to have shared this hour with you, Arnold. I feel quite emotional. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you so much.
Thank you both. What a thoughtful and enriching chat about trauma and healing, memory and forgetting, and the value of stories too. We'll go downstairs and you can carry on with the conversation and perhaps pick up a book too. Kim and Arnold are hanging around for a bit, so join me again in thanking Arnold.